Hello, and welcome to my channel. What this channel is going to be about is stories, real life stories. I was going to initially read books, but I soon found out the entire web of copyright issues that followed. So I decided to do this something more real. They'll range from happy, giddy even, to horror. Just nice little short stories to anything else. And if enough of you guys watch the videos that I make and decide to submit your own real life story, or maybe one that you've written, I'd be happy to read it. Now this one that I'm going to read is my first video. I was actually planning to read a more lighthearted one, but I found this and it was submitted by somebody. And I don't know, it caught my eye. Let us begin. It is titled, I Killed the Man Today. And it goes on as such. He was an innocent, good-hearted person that didn't do anything to anyone, and I killed him. I work in an assisted living facility as a male nurse. I never really wanted to go into nursing, but my parents pushed me to become a doctor. But the furthest I got was a nursing degree. I couldn't handle the pace of a regular hospital, so I ended up here, in death's waiting room. I've been there for nearly 10 years. It's not a bad job, the money's okay, and it's quiet. It's a pretty good deal for a slacker like me. The man we're talking about is, or was, a patient here. This facility is for the long-term care of severely injured or disabled patients. Most of them don't stay with us for long, if you understand what I mean. He was one of the few patients who was here since I started at this place. We called him John Doe since we never really learned his name. Even the death certificate has John Doe on it. John had actually spent half of his life here. I found out from some of the other nurses that he was in his early 20s when they brought him in. He was in his 40s now, tall and lean, a little thin, but not gaunt. He was in surprisingly good shape considering his situation. The only outward sign of illness was his complete lack of hair. I've seen bald men before, of course, but this was different. He looked unnatural, sickly, although he wasn't on any medication that would cause this. He had suffered some kind of traumatic brain injury that left him almost completely non-responsive. Although he was not comatose, he had what we call locked-in syndrome. The sufferers are often mentally conscious and alert, but completely paralyzed throughout their body. John was a special case. He had limited movement in his facial and jaw muscles. He couldn't speak, but he could sometimes hold a pencil in his mouth and write words in short sentences when he felt strong enough. He could also make simple guttural noises and slightly move his head, but other than that, he had no power of movement. Most of the time, he would just lie there, staring. I never wondered what thoughts went through his head. The staff, like me, assumed in our ignorance that his mind was as sedentary as his body. We were wrong. He never had any visitors, none that I saw anyway, with just one exception. Once, years ago, I remember hearing a voice from his room. Since he never had guests, I went to investigate, and I met a woman wearing a hooded jacket, seeming to float past me. She had just left John's room, and she was crying. I called out to her, but she simply quickened her step, and then she was gone. I never saw her or anyone else come to visit John again. About 2 years ago, some PhD students from a local university came to see John. They had found out about his case from one of our facility's administrators. Their PhD was in medical devices and computing. And in return for using John's case in their dissertation, they provided him with an invention of theirs made during their research. It was a small computer of sorts that John wore around his neck. He held the straw in his mouth and used it to control the machine. It took advantage of his very limited movement and allowed him to speak by choosing words one at a time to form sentences, which were then spoken aloud using the synthesizer. It was quite advanced stuff, way beyond me. For the first few weeks, John used this device to ask for extra blankets or other simpler things. But then he started to say more. I usually work the night shift. I get paid more that way, and I don't have much of a social life really, so the strange hours don't bother me. Nothing much happens at night, so it's usually just me and maybe one or two other nurses in the whole place. One night after I finished getting John ready for bed and had turned to leave, I heard the synthesizer calling my name, my actual name. That wasn't part of his database of words, so he must have added it letter by letter. As I turned, I saw him looking at me. His vacant, dead eyes were replaced with a piercing stare. He called my name again. That night he spoke to me. It was clearly hard for him. I could see him struggling as he grew tired. With broken, monotonous speech, he told me things I never wanted to hear. Though his synthesized words were devoid of all emotion, they held such a depth of human suffering that I could almost feel what he felt. He spoke of pain, of suffering so unbearable it could almost kill with the power of it alone. Almost. I realized for the first time that John's mind was as sharp as it ever was. He had the same dreams, the same hopes, same desires of any man. He truly was locked in. This was the first time he asked me to kill him. I refused, of course. I'm not a murderer, or at least I wasn't. I empathized with him. I can't imagine how I'd feel in his position. It must have been torture. But I just couldn't do what he asked. I had my shifts changed. I switched to days. The place was busier during the day. There were a lot more nurses around, so I could avoid going to John's room. Weeks went by, and I never thought of him. I'm surprised and a bit ashamed at how easy it was to forget about what he had said and what he had asked me to do. It's not that I didn't care, I just couldn't process it. So I pushed it to the back of my mind, but eventually my schedule changed again, and I ran out of favors. I was back on the night shift. That meant I'd had to tend to John again. For the next few weeks, things weren't much different from before. I mean, it's not like we used to have long conversations or anything, so there was no awkward silences or noticeable tension. But I did try to avoid his eyes. There was such deep sadness there that I never noticed before. We used to give John drops to moisturize his eyes, since we noticed they would become slightly inflamed and teary. We assumed it was from the cold, dry air in the room. I now know that he was crying silent tears. One night, near the start of my shift, I prepared to tend to John as usual, but I approached his room. Something felt different. I felt almost disconnected, like it was a dream. This slightly disturbing feeling continued with me as I changed John's sheets, turned to him, and performed my usual duties. As I turned to leave, I heard my name from John's synthesizer. I froze. I was still the only person he ever called by name. The rest of the staff didn't even know he could do this. I looked around slowly, and he was twitching and slightly turning his head, using all of his limited mobility. He seemed to be motioning toward the table beside his bed, where his personal effects were. I carefully picked up and replaced his things until I heard his low, guttural grunt, his only natural form of communication. I was holding a piece of finely woven cloth, maybe silk. I unwrapped it, and inside was an old picture. I moved into the light so that way I could see it properly. And that was the moment when my world changed. That was the moment when I knew I had to become a killer. It was a woman. She was beautiful, gorgeous even. I looked at the woman and I froze. Because it was then at that moment that I realized that she looked nearly exactly like the woman that I had seen coming out of the room all those years ago. But here I could see her face clearly for the first time. She had bright sky blue eyes and a smile that made even my heart flutter, and I didn't even know her. It was the most sincere, genuine smile I have ever seen. Her whole face lit up. I've seen some fake plastic Pan Am smiles in my time. This wasn't one of them. It actually took me a few seconds to recognize the man in the picture. The long-haired, chiseled good looks of the man John used to be. He was holding the woman, sharing her smile, and taking the picture of the two of them. They both looked so happy. It was then that I understood. It was like time had stopped. I felt an unnatural stillness descend down the room. It was like we were the only two people on the planet. John would never love again. He'd never feel a woman's touch, her kiss, or ever hear her laugh again. He would never feel the excited nervousness of asking a woman on a date, or the joy of hearing her say yes. He'd never wake up next to her, feel the contentment and happiness of companionship. He'd never have kids, watch them grow up, attend their football games, or teach them about life. He would never grow old with a lady by his side. After facing the world together, he was truly alone. The pillow felt like it was made of lead as I picked it up. My heart pounding, I felt sick. I swallowed hard, attempting to control my growing nauseousness. I glanced at John's eyes one last time, as if asking him, pleading with him. But his gaze told me all I needed to know. I looked away and did what I had to do. It didn't take long. He wanted to go. But it felt like an eternity. The alarms. I didn't even think about the alarms, the life support machine. As the other nurses rushed in, I hurriedly pretended to revive John, but it was too late. I said I was tending to another patient when I heard the alarms go off in John's room, and I rushed to his aid. The official cause of death was respiratory failure. I think the head nurse, Richard, suspected, but if he did, he didn't say anything. What good would it do? John was in pain, so much pain. Not physical, but very real. What could we do for him? Keep him hooked up to our machines for the next 10, 20, 30 years? That's no life. Not for anyone. I'm not asking for forgiveness or sympathy. I don't regret what I did. But I had to tell someone. Just remember, you don't need ghosts or demons for a horror story. Sometimes real life is plenty. I know I'll never sleep again. And that concludes my very first video. If you liked it, or would like me to read something else, I'm open for suggestions. Now, as I said before, there won't be all doom and gloom horror stuff on my channel. I like to read an entire medley, plethora of different genres. But I do hope that you enjoy this reading, and there will be plenty more. And if you did watch this way, all this way, from beginning to end, I'll have you know that there's nothing wrong with the video. I purposely have it on black screen because it's all about the reading, the sharing of information, real life stories with real people, to make real connections, to remind humanity that while we are in the age of the internet, we tend to get lost in it. We tend to forget that life is this real thing that's meant for living. We tend to forget that there's an entire world outside of our tiny little screens. This is one such story that I hope reminds everyone that life is there for the taking. And if you don't take it, sooner or later, it won't be there left to grab. So I'd like to thank whoever watched once again. I don't exactly yet have a scheduling of when I'll be uploading videos, but they will be on a semi-regular basis. So until next time, stay safe, stay smart,